This morning we're going to be looking at 1 Peter chapter 2, and we're going to be discussing a section of Scripture that is not always easy to apply. It is oftentimes easy to understand what it says, but the problem sometimes is in the application of that. So I'd like to ask if we look at this as I read it this morning, beginning in verse 18, and we'll read all the way through to the end of the chapter this morning, although we won't cover the bottom part of this chapter. Let's look this morning, beginning with verse 18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer, if you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but now have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. That's not fair. I'm not sure if this has ever been the first words the child has ever spoken, but it certainly is an attitude we get early on, isn't it? That's not fair. I didn't get what I deserve. They got something and I didn't get it. I'm suffering unjustly. And it seems like that it's right there any time that things don't go our way. That's not fair. That's just not fair. And we all know the response, right? Who said it was fair? Life is not fair. And yet, for so many people, this is exactly how they approach life. They have this mentality, this idea that somehow they have been entitled to always having life their own way. And this is especially true in the matter of unjust suffering, or when we struggle under unfair authority, leadership. When we're answerable to somebody and we keep thinking in our minds, that's just not fair. I think whenever we have this feeling that we've been unjustly treated, we see with it the spirit of rebellion and independence that causes us sometimes even to rant and to rave. We pout, maybe not literally jump up and down, but we insist that people treat us right. And I think that if we live with this mentality, that we see that it somehow has an effect even on our life with Christ. We don't see the big picture. We only see how it's not fair for us, how it's not right for us. How dare they do that to me? And oftentimes that affects our understanding of our relationship with Jesus Christ. Because we have, as Christians, an entirely different approach, or we should have. We aren't in the sense of rebellion. We're not in this sense of fatalistic karma that always comes around what comes around. But we have a life devoted to loving and serving Jesus Christ. We have a different perspective. We may be in this world, as Peter is saying, but we're not of this world. And that's really been the purpose of Peter's letter that we've been looking at. He really is writing to us and writing to this first century church and these believers, writing how to live successfully in a fallen, unfair world full of sin. It was true in their case, and it's still true in ours as well. For we see lots of wickedness and suffering. And Peter, in writing this, is not sugarcoating the world and not saying it's not that bad. Just suck it up and go on with it. He's telling us to look at it from a totally different perspective. And he started the letter back in chapter 1 by saying, because we are the elect of God in Christ, we have this amazing identity and this amazing inheritance from Christ. But he says also, not only are we the elect of God, that we're also sojourners, aliens, exiles in this world. And that we will experience trials, and we will experience struggles, and we will deal with sorrows, and sometimes they will seem unfair. But what Peter is writing to tell us is that there is always purpose behind them. And the purpose can be ultimately to test our faith. Let's turn back to chapter 1. We read this, and we read this, and it sounded so nice now. Now that we're dealing with real issues of being unfairly treated and having to submit to those kind of situations, it takes a little bit of perspective. Let's go back to see what he says at the beginning about this. He says that we have been caused, according to verse 2 of chapter 1, verse 3, he says, blessed be the God, according to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who are by God's power being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed at the last time. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. Boy, that sounded so good back then. We read chapter 1. Now we're actually seeing what the trials are, and it's taking a little different perspective. But we do that, he says, knowing that, so he says, for necessary various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So the trials we have purpose and meaning. So we talk about the idea of not how to get out of a trial, as much as we talk about what to get out of a trial. What are we going to experience? What is God intending for us to learn through this time? And so Peter is saying, you're going to experience some pretty unjust things. You're going to experience life, and you're going to say oftentimes, even as a believer, that's not fair. Does Peter have something to give to us? Does God have something to give for us encouragement? Absolutely. I wouldn't be here this morning preaching if I didn't feel like I didn't know there was going to be great encouragement that's here. Chapter 2, we talked about that. He says that as long as we're in the world, it matters to God how we live. It's important to think about, and this is what Peter is dealing with, different facets of our life. And it's important how we feel. And we live as unto the Lord. And he told us back in verse 11 that we are to live in two ways: to abstain from evil, which is our personal holiness, and to keep our conduct honorable, which is public integrity. To abstain from evil and to keep our conduct honorable. And having said that, then, beginning in verse 13, he gives to us this key concept, which is going to carry us for the next chapter, almost 2 chapters. He says how that looks. You can boil all of this down to one word: submit. If you miss that word, you're not going to get whatever else he has to say. Peter is saying, therefore, because we have been blessed with so much, he is talking to us now and leading us to a key concept by which we can accomplish and live successfully as aliens in this world, as the elect of God, and that is, verse 13, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Now, I must hesitate to go on to say this is not talking about being a doormat. This is not talking about lay down, do nothing. We're doing it as unto the Lord. That means we have every right to, sometimes we may need to tell authorities, No, I can't do that if it causes us to violate some direct command of God. And like I said last week, we're so busy looking for the loopholes that we fail to miss the key of what he's saying here. Because in more chances than not, in more occasions than not, we are called to submit regardless, and to yield and to humble ourselves, not because that person is better than us, not because that person is more powerful than us. We submit because this is what God has called us to do. Amazingly, even through our attitude and our way we submit to authorities, God is not only blessed, but he uses our life in witnessing opportunities. He talks about in verse 15, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorant of foolish people. And he talks about we do this, we willingly submit as free people. We're free to come under authority. We're free to submit because of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so having said that then, we saw last week that he's talked about the idea of how we are to deal with relationships. And we talked about last week about the government, how we are to respond to government. And boy, that could have taken us a long time to deal with that. Are we subjective to government? Are we under submission? Do we yield, working for the good of God in this situation? And now Peter's theme in this portion has turned to submission in the midst of suffering. Did you get that in the passage we read? He's talking about what if we suffer? What if we come and so quickly we want to say, that's not fair. How do we respond? What is God's call for our life at this point? It is how we're dealing with this and how we're looking at this. And turning where now he's dealt with this, he's turning now from the civil authorities, and now he focuses on the submission of slaves to their earthly masters. That's beginning in verse 18, which we talk about mainly of work ethics. We're looking at the attitude that these slaves were to have toward their masters. But in principle, it can be applied to any situation. You say, yes, Pastor, I work at a place, and I would think of that as being a slave-master situation. I work in a situation where, man, I just feel like I'm just the slave running around doing all of these things. Well, maybe not like Peter is talking about here, but certainly we may be under obligation. And that could be in a employer-employee or management relationship. It could be in a school. It could be even within our family. It is anywhere, any situation that requires obedience. How do we respond? And this is what Peter is talking about. In fact, someone has said that Peter was giving ethics for exiles. And the one theme that he repeats over and over again is submission to authority. We have to understand this key understanding. What does it mean to submit? Because we either go to one extreme or the other, don't we? We fall to one ditch or the other. Either we say, okay, well, I'll submit to every single thing regardless and just kind of live our life and just kind of just put our head down and kind of have the mentality that one person had in our church that basically said, life is a rock and then you die. Life is hard and then you die. And just kind of put your head down and kind of just get on through. On the other hand, we have people who are rebellious. No one's going to ever tell me what to do. And they live in this rebellion, and they're looking for the opportunities to leap onto other situations. Peter's saying we need to ignore both of those. And he repeats, whether it be to the state, whether it be to the employer, or as we get a little bit further on, even within the marriage, this idea of submission. What does that look like? It is a paramount duty of every Christian to have a life living in submission. And when we say that, it strikes right at the root of pride. Some of you may be already bristling in your minds thinking, Pastor, you don't know the situation I'm in. You don't know the people I have to answer to. Man, talk about life's not fair, and I'm fair to say that life is not fair. We're not going to bow to anybody. We don't want to submit to any authority. We don't have to do what we have to do, and we do that with a negative attitude. Because our sin nature always wants to be free, with accounting to nobody. And yet, as followers of Jesus Christ, we see his command to be subject to governing authorities. And God never exhorts without equipping. God never asks us to do something without giving to us the ability to do that. And so that's what we see getting before us. And so now we're looking at how we serve the Lord in our work ethics. How we live under authority, whether it be at work or at school or in relationships, somehow, somewhere. Now, we always think about serving God in special ways. We always think about with serving God, that's some unique opportunity. That's some missionary going to some other country, or that's some big event that takes place. I'm serving the Lord. And that is true. But God also looks at how we serve him in the daily grind of life and how we live under authority. And I think that whether at work or not, somebody say, well, I'm retired, I don't work, I don't go to school. No one is never outside of authority. You are not the top dog in this world. Somewhere you have accountability and you have a yielding to some kind of authority in your life. God has ordained that for us. God has worked that for us. And how we respond to that authority is very telling how we respond to God in that authority. And so it's really important that we understand this. Even in the daily routines of life, we want to, in a sense, master the ordinary for the glory of God. And to know that we can hope in Christ, even in your trials. To add the word but to the phrase, that's not fair, but God is in control. And I can still live my life even in this situation, even under these circumstances. And so it's important for us to get this understanding of submission. We miss it and we get it all wrong. Someone likened this to the IKEA instructions. You ever buy something from IKEA? You build this bookcase and you get it home and you pull out the instructions and you say, I know how to do this. I don't need these instructions to build a bookcase. And after 2 hours, your bookcase looks more like something like modern art that will never hold a book. And you've got 5 or 6 boxes and piles of stuff and screws and all sorts of things, and you don't know how to all put together. This is IKEA instructions. It may be seeming a little more complicated, but it's important for us to get this. It's important for us to understand if we are building our life that will bring glory to Christ. And so I want to divide this section up between verses 18 and we'll go through 23 today. And I want to look at it from 3 different perspectives. I want to look at it and how we deal with this matter, especially of where he says servants must be subject to your masters. The first thing I want to look at in dealing with this is the principle of submitting. First thing I'm going to look at is the principle of submitting. Because if you're going to submit in the right way, it begins with, first of all, having the right attitude. If you're going to have the right action, and if you're going to be able to submit biblically in the right way, it's because you have had the right attitude of approaching this thing. And this is where Peter begins with this. And in a sense, he talks about, by his announcing the topic in verse 18, servants. Servants. That's where he gets this. And that's where our mind goes to beginning this whole passage. So it is a sense of having the right attitude consists in this passage of 2 things. It consists, to have the right attitude, you must have a servant's heart. You must have a servant's heart. Peter is addressing those who are slaves, but this topic expands out to any circumstance when we're under authority. Now, I know that slave is a hot button topic right now. And I know that that's an issue that we could kind of spiral off on. And I want you to be clear that we detest any kind of slavery today. And that the Bible never sanctions slavery. But the Bible was written in a time of a fallen world, an evil world, a sinful world where slaves existed. And so he's telling them, how do you live under those conditions? In fact, as one theologian wrote this, in order to understand the real meaning of what Peter says, we really have to understand something of the nature of slavery in the time of the Roman Empire. Because in that time period, there were as many as 60 million slaves. Slaves were not a small segment of their society. In some places, there were more than half of the entire population was in some kind of slavery. It began with Roman conquest, when they would go and take other nations, and they had them by the New Testament time, counting them in millions. But it was not just the menial tasks. Doctors, teachers, musicians, actors, secretaries, stewards were all slaves. In fact, all of the work was done by slaves. The Roman mentality was, let's let the slaves do it, and they lived in pampered idleness. So it would be always wrong to think that all the time the lot of slaves were always wretched and unhappy, and that they were always treated with cruelty. Sometimes there were slaves who were loved and trusted by members of the family. Some of them even were inheritors of others' legacies and money. But we do need to realize, though, that involved in all of this, that the slave was still a slave and still answerable and accountable to a master. And so Peter is writing this to understand, how do you live in this situation? Now, Paul says if you have the opportunity to get free, get free. But they lived in a place where they weren't going to get free. And in a sense, Peter's saying, they're saying, Peter, do you have any word for us? Do you have any word for us who will never get out of this condition of our life? How do we live our life? And that's what Peter is writing about. And so he has this with the idea of having a servant's heart. He says to them, servants. Now I know that I've probably by now have convinced you that every time you see the word servant, that you should cross that out and put the word slave, the word doulos, with this exception. This is one of the exceptions where this is not the word doulos. So don't, if you're starting to scratch out the word servant, put the word slave in, don't. This is a whole different word. In fact, this word comes from the word for house. It meant the household servant or the household slave. It is literally the word of a domestic or a household slave. And this is the kind of master that the slave had to be at the beck and call of the master all the time. The household slave had to clean the house, care for the master, cook the meals, and do all the jobs necessary. We call that today sometimes moms. I won't get cards letters for that one, I hope not. But the whole idea here is that even though we may not be these servants, house servants, we are under some kind of authority. We are obligated to some kind of person. And so it's important for us to evaluate where you are. And Peter says that you are to be subject to them. Servants, be subject. That's the first part, is understanding this idea of submission is an attitude of a servant's heart. And to evaluate, what do I think going into this? Now, you may not be in a servant position, but certainly you're serving others. It should not be what are they there for me, but how can I be for them? How can I serve them? How can somebody else be better because I'm in their life? Maintaining a servant's heart, having an attitude is really important here. And the next thing that Peter says about this is that we are to be subject with all respect, my translation says here. Be subject to servants, be subject to your masters with all respect. And I think they lose something in that translation. Because the word there for respect is actually the word phobia, fear. You say, yeah, I work at a job where I have to be afraid of the boss. The boss comes in and we all start working. When the boss leaves, we quit, but I'm afraid of my boss. That person is a real tyrant, which always makes me wonder, when Paul was teaching at Ephesus, he was teaching in the hall that belonged to Tyrannus. And Tyrannus is a word that means tyrant. I'm wondering if that was a teacher who was a real tyrant in what he was teaching. But the idea is we live in fear. And so some people try to translate this as respect. But I think there's something more to that. I think there's something deeper to that. If we understand that this word is the word fear, not to be afraid of them, but notice where we have seen that word just one verse up, where we're told that we are to fear God. And so if I believe that if we're going to have the right attitude, that we're going to have a servant's heart, and that we're going to do it as unto God, to fear, not be afraid of God, but to do it with the awareness that what I am doing is as if I were submitting to God himself. To have this presence and this awareness. In fact, later on, he's even going to specifically talk about that. So we really need to examine our attitudes. Do I have a proper attitude? Do I have one of submission, or am I selfishly fighting for my rights? Do I find myself saying more often, that's not fair? Or do we say, how can I serve you? What can I do to make my boss, the one in authority over me, how can I make them more successful? How can I bless them for the Lord's sake? It begins with attitudes. Now, if I'm truly in submission and I'm not acting with selfish reasons, I think that there would be a proper place for respectful communication that seeks to clarify and to make of convictions. In other words, if our attitudes and motives are in submission to God, we need not always silently endure unjust treatment as Christian doormats. There is a proper place for self-defense and for confronting the errors of those who've mistreated us, as long as we do it in God's way for God's glory. There are those occasions when we can speak up, as long as we maintain the attitude of having a servant's heart and that we're doing it as unto the Lord. That's what he's talking about. Having the right attitude. Having the right attitude then leads to the second part of this, which means the second one is this, leads to the right action. And what is that action? Very simply, it is to submit. That's the right action, submit. Now this submission is not rote obedience. Submission is not the same as to just obey. It carries into it, but it's a deeper thought. It revolves around God's order and God's structure for his creation, which includes the idea of authority. He has ordained authority. We saw in Romans chapter 13, there is no governing authority except by what he has ordained. And there is no authority in your life except that God has ordained it to be there. And he's ordained it to be there so that we might know how to react to it, because he has a purpose behind it to bring glory to him and to conform us to the image of Jesus Christ, which we see at the end of this passage suffered the greatest unfair. If anybody could say that's not fair, it would have been Jesus. If anybody could have said, I'm not going to take this anymore, it was Jesus. And yet, for the purposes to bring glory to the Father and salvation to us, he suffered the most unjust situation and willingly put himself under the authority of those who eventually killed him. And Peter's saying, if Jesus could do that, then beloved, we could do this. And so it calls for the right action. We talked about the word for submit is hupatasso, which means to be subject and actively involving by placing yourself under the authority of someone else with the intent to obey. Submission also involves not only seeking one's own interests, but rather assuming a voluntary commitment of service to others. I mean, ultimately, if you don't like the job you're in, you could leave it. But Peter is writing to these people to say this is the mentality that you want to have. The right attitude leads to the right action. And so he says that we are to be to subject yourself to masters, not only to the good and the gentle, but also to the unjust. Peter is saying you may have a situation where you see somebody who is good and gentle. He says, what a blessing. That's great. If you've got that, praise the Lord. He says, and I really don't have anything for you. It's easy to submit, isn't it? When you have a nice, kind, tender, good boss. But also for those who may be in position of authority, this is the kind of quality you should have. Paul talks about that much later on as well. But it may not always be this case. This may not be your experience. You may see something less than a good, godly person. You may be like the two kids who were running up and down the hallway at school, and the principal was so upset at them that he got to them and he grabbed one of them and he says, student, I think, young man, I think the devil's got a hold of you. To which the little boy looked up at him and says, yeah, I think so too. We may have that kind of ruler. We may have that kind of authority. Peter zooms in on this. Peter's saying, if you've got somebody that's nice and good and it's blessing, great. But you may not have that. Your authority may not be this way. Your authority may be unreasonable. And that's what Peter zooms in on in this case. He says down here, he says, not only to the good and gentle, but to the unjust. That word, interesting, the word unjust there, actually in the Greek is the word skolios. We hear that, don't we? We hear of the word scoliosis, which means what? A curvature of the spine. It's the word that literally means something that is bent, something that is crooked, something that is curved. And spiritually speaking, it is somebody that is perverse and somebody who is unfair. And Peter says you may be encountering these kinds of people. Unreasonable sometimes might be a good translation. Harsh, hard to deal with, unbending, unkind, ungracious. But in either case, what are you supposed to do, Peter says? Submit. Submit to those in authority. Verse 18. Submit. I think about the example of, in the Old Testament, of David. Remember the story of David, the mighty shepherd king, who, before he became king, was under the authority of another king, King Saul. And yet, even though we know that Saul would have fit this bill, he would have been the unjust, unfair, unreasonable kind of a king, the skolios, David always remained under his authority. Even when he had the chance to kill him, he never did. Even when David knew that he was going to be the next king and Saul had already been rejected by the Lord, even when he knew that Saul had no right and no power being a king, David still lived under his authority, waiting on God to carry out his plan. He lived for 1.5 years as a fugitive in the wilderness. The one who had the right to be king, here is a man who would not rebel. Here is a man who would not take things into his own hands. Here is one that would wait patiently for the Lord and submit to the authority over him. That's what Peter is talking about here. Peter has zeroed in to the more difficult circumstance. And he said, if you're going to be able to submit properly, it requires having the right attitude. It requires having the right action, leads to the right action. And then the third thing he talks about is having, verse 19, having the right awareness. Verse 19 is this kind of awareness in which it gives you the ability in Christ to even willingly and joyfully submit. And how do we do that? He says, with the right awareness. And who is that awareness to? To God. Verse 19, for this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Sometimes in submitting, Peter says, you will experience sorrows. Now, those sorrows are not, the word here involves much more. It's the word lupe, which involves the word pain or struggle. Sometimes he says you will encounter this, you will experience this. And yet Peter says it is commendable to bear up in that, to still submit, to still endure, to keep on keeping on. And you say, well, who in the world, commendable to whom? And we know the answer, don't we? To God. It is commendable to God. Peter says your action is to be so faithful, and it can be by prompting by a conscious sense of God's presence. You know He's there. You know He's watching. You know you can endure. And so you're suffering unjustly, but you never falter in your witness. You accept it. You accept it in humility and patience, trusting God, confident of His total control, and you're accepting it. And what does it say? That pleases God. That pleases God. For this is a gracious thing, literally a grace thing. When mindful of God, you endure sorrows while suffering unjustly. So you suffer unjustly. You even experience sorrows because of that. And yet if you endure with the awareness of God. And when that happens, you are being commended by God. So it's not even about the authorities, is it? It is about your life and how you submit to whatever authority you have in your life before God. And that's what Peter is talking about. He says this is commendable. Now, beginning in verse 20, so the principle of this, if you want to know the principle of submitting, it begins with having the right attitude that leads to the right action with the right awareness of God behind all of it. I can submit to authority because as I am submitting, it is commendable before God. But Peter goes on now. In fact, now he continues to lay layers of the condition onto the principle. We talked about someone being crooked, being unfair, suffering. You're going to do good and get slammed for it. All the way up to the example of Jesus Christ. So now we move from the principle. The second thing that he's talking about, beginning in verse 20, is the practice of submitting. The practice of submitting. How do you put this into place? How do you make this work? How does it happen? And Peter is talking about that beginning in verse 20. And he talks about three things. He talks about the conditions. He gives us conditions, and he begins by dealing with the obvious. He says, for what credit is there when you sin and harshly treated for it, you endure with patience? Well, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? I mean, if you do something wrong and get called out for it, and you endure that, that's nothing commendable there. You got what you deserved. You should have gotten that situation. Again, I've got nothing for you. Just like if you're submitting to a nice and gentle and kind boss, I got nothing for you. If you're doing wrong and get punished for it, I got nothing for you. So he kind of eliminates those kind of things. But what he zeroes in on is that whole concept of that's not fair. What if the conditions were unfair? What if, as verse 20 says, but when you do good and suffer for it? If you do bad and suffer, he says, we got that all taken care of. But when you do good, and either for whatever, he doesn't say the reasons why. Maybe you're misunderstood. Maybe you are the only Christian in a place where you work, and anything that good you do, because the world is to the point now where the world calls good evil and evil good. For whatever reason, Peter says, he doesn't even qualify that. He just simply says, when you do good and suffer for it. And that same word here is to suffer. It means to experience great sorrow. It means to experience great turmoil in your life. And you get to the point of thinking, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm out of here. I don't like this unfair suffering. I put all the effort in and didn't get any attention for it. I did good and I got slammed for it. There was a movie once about a couple that were talking about their relationship was not good. And so he was challenged to 40 days, do nothing but good for his wife, serve his wife, serve as unto the Lord to his wife. And so the first morning he got up early and he made this coffee and made this breakfast. She came through, looked at the cup of coffee, poured the cup of coffee in the sink, grabbed the toast only and ran out the door. And his first thought was, why in the world did I ever do that? That's not going to make any difference at all. That's the mentality that's here. Paul is saying, what happens when you do good? What are the conditions when you do good and you get slammed for it? Well, what does he say? He talks about the consistency here, doesn't he? If we want the blessing of being under a situation that is not fair, and I think now that it's even more expanded to just job relationship. I think any relationship, any situation in verse 20, when we want to do good and we suffer for it. Peter says, the practice is to be consistent. So the conditions of the practice would be whether you suffer or not. The second part of this would be the consistency. If you endure. Hupomeno. Stay right there. Stay to your post. That's a military term that means you've been assigned to this spot, and soldier, you better stay at that spot. That's the concept behind the word. And Peter is saying, if you do good, which we should be as believers, right? We're not out to undermine a boss or those in authority over us. But if you do good, and the condition I think can be spread out to any situation where you're devoted to doing good to somebody else, and rather than being blessed by it, you suffer for it. If you endure. If you say, I'm going to keep my side of the street clean. I'm going to consistently do what I know to be the right thing to do. If we do that, then the third part of this practice process is, it is commendable before God. Not the suffering is commendable. The enduring is commendable. Did you see that? Verse 20. But if when you do good and suffer, and for it you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. This is the endurance. The keeping on of keeping on. And why is that possible? Because we have been empowered by Christ to do that. And secondly, is because we know that in the doing of that, this is highly commendable to God. You want to do something that gains God's well done, good and faithful servant? Endure. Stay the course. What it's going to say is, you think you're going to bail out. Let me give you the example of Jesus Christ. Let's compare your suffering to his suffering. Let's compare how things are unfair to you based on how unfair it was to him, and what did he do? We're going to look at that in a minute here as we wrap up this. But the point of it is here that we endure. And so the practice of submitting consists of the conditions, irregardless of the conditions. The consistency is if you endure. That's what the practice is, to endure, to keep going. And I know we get discouraged, whether it be in a family situation, whether it be in a work situation, whether it be whatever it may be, when we have this idea of submitting and doing benefits for the other person, it may come to the point where it's like, what's the use? Every time I try to do something, I get slammed for it. Peter's saying, stay the course. Because you're not just doing it for that person. You're doing it as unto the Lord. And so there's a consistency. And to recognize that there is a benefit. There is a commendation from no one less than God himself when you stay faithful. And that's what Peter is talking about here. You get a commendation. 3 qualifications, Peter says. First, it is suffering that pleases God, must be innocent suffering. Right? If you do it because of sin, that's a whole other case. It must be done with patience. Doing it for conscience sake as unto the Lord. And so Peter has given to us the principle of submission. And then he talks about the practice of this, even if you're doing it and you get slammed for it. And then thirdly, the third thing that Peter talks about here is the priority of submitting. The priority of submitting. Verse 21 through 23. The priority. You say, well, submitting, it's kind of an optional thing. It's kind of a thing, if I feel like submitting, I can do it. If not, I won't. No. Verse 21. Because to this, what is the this? Suffering unjustly. Enduring when life is not fair. Do you realize that's your calling in life? Do you all see that? In verse 21. For to this you have volunteered? No. You have been forced? No. You have been called. You know what God's calling? What is God's will for my life? What is God's calling for my life? Well, the one thing is to suffer. Why? Because we are the elect of God and we are aliens in this world. And this is part, and that's why we went back to chapter 1, because he says there is purpose in doing that. There is purpose in this calling. This purpose is to test your faith. It's one thing to say, I believe in God, when you're living under a master that is kind and generous. It's one thing to say, I can serve God, I can submit when all is going well. I can be obedient, Lord, to you. I can answer the call when all is good in the world. But what if things aren't good in the world? What if you have a scoliosis authority? What if you do good and it gets slammed for it? Oh, that's the real test. That's the real thing. That's where God has called you, because when we do that, we are helpless apart from that. But when we do that, we are calling on God to give us the strength. He is glorified in this. And we read earlier that in some way, when we do this, that is what God uses as a witness for salvation to the very one that is slamming us in the meantime. This is God's plan for your life. Not only are you called to believe in Him, but also to suffer for Him. You say, well, that's just one isolated verse, right, Pastor? If I'm ever going to go back to this verse again, I'm okay, right? No, it's throughout the New Testament. Philippians 3:10. This is what Paul says. That I may know Him and the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of His sufferings, being conformed to His death. When we suffer for doing good, there is a relationship and a fellowship with Christ that cannot be attained in any other way. Another verse talks about, it says, for you have been, first Philippians 1:29, one of my favorite verses, for to you it has been granted for Christ's sake, not only to believe in him, but to also suffer for his sake. Because when you're doing good, it is for his sake. Now, if you're doing your own good, your own thing, I have to bear this cross. My arthritis is my cross I have to bear. I'm suffering for Jesus in this way. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about doing good for his sake. We're talking about doing good and getting slammed for it and enduring. How can we endure? By the grace and the power of Christ. If you're in a situation where you're about ready to give up and you're not able to endure any longer, you know one of two things. Either you're about ready to get out of that situation, or God is going to give you the strength to continue to be faithful for his sake. Because that's your calling in life. You don't think, well, Lord, if you just give me these bad situations, Lord, if you could just get my boss fired, I would have a much better job. I could serve you. If you just got this person out of my life, then I would be happy and I could follow your will. I could do whatever you have planned for my life. And God says, no, that is your life. That is your calling. That is your purpose. For you've been called to this. And so it is sometimes through unjust suffering that we really learn how to trust God. Suffering is a basic part of being a Christian. So we kind of almost have to kind of get used to that. But not only did God give us a plan, the priority, if this is God's plan for your life, then it's a pretty high priority. But there's a second thing. Not only is there God's plan for your life, but Peter goes on to give us this great joy. There is Christ's perfect example. Christ's perfect example. He says, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example. Now, next week we're going to talk about his unique role as Savior, but he's also our example. And that's what Peter is talking about here. He is also the example. The example is interesting. The word in the Greek here for example comes from two Greek words, hupo, meaning before, and grapho, meaning to write. It's only used here in the New Testament. It literally means to be writing under. Let me give you an example. How many of you in school, when you were learning how to write cursive or were learning how to write the letters of the alphabet, you had this template with these dotted letters, and you traced out the letters, and you learned how to write those letters? If we were in Greek, we'd use this word. It means to trace out something that has been given to you to fulfill. Christ has become, in this case, our hupogrammos. We trace out his life to see, how did he do this? Because the way that he did this, I want to do this. The way he faced unjust persecution, how he faced when life was not fair, I want to know how he did this. And that's what Peter is telling us. He gave us an example so that we might follow in his steps. And what does he say here? Several things. First of all, verse 22, here's what Jesus did. Put off and put on. What did he put off? First of all, he said, he committed no sin. He committed no sin. Throughout this whole process, there was never any sin involved in what Jesus did. What would have happened if Jesus would have sinned? He would have ceased to be our Redeemer. And how he faced the criticisms, how he faced unjust situations, how he faced all the turmoil and the suffering in his life, he did it without sin at all in his life. That's our pattern. Do we do that? Or are we quick to sin, quick to be attitude or actions when we face a situation? Second thing he says what Jesus did was, the second thing is that he did not revile in return. He did not revile in return. His suffering was righteous suffering. His suffering was silent. Also, it says, third, when he suffered, he did not threaten. We do that, right? That's not fair. How dare you? I'm getting back at you. And that didn't happen at all. So what did he do? What did he do? He didn't sin. We shouldn't sin. There wasn't deceit found in his mouth. He committed no sin. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. He did not threaten. But what did he do? He continued to entrust himself to him who judges justly. He continued to entrust himself to his Father. When it didn't make sense to him, when he couldn't get away from it, and he could have, there would have been a point where Jesus said, this is just too much. He could have been done with it. We've been told that he had legions of angels in the way that could have taken him off of the cross. He would have gone back into heaven. He would have been Lord of Lords and King of Kings, and he would have not lost one bit of his glory and his majesty and who he was, just that we wouldn't have had salvation. And that's what Peter is talking about. He's saying if Jesus could experience the depth of being unfair in life, when we say that's not fair, and then we think of ourselves, whether it be at our job or whether it be in school or whether it be in our relationships with other people, and we're tempted to say that's not fair, and we want to get out of it, and we want to have not a submissive heart, but a heart that is filled with pride. Peter is saying, look to Jesus. See what Jesus did. See what Jesus did on your behalf. See how Jesus redeemed you and what it took for him to redeem you. To go to a place where he says, that's not fair. And yet what did he do? He didn't try to get back. He entrusted himself to God. And in that, he became our example. When we think that life is unfair, and when Peter tells us to submit, when Peter says, continue on and endure and keep on keeping on, even when there's people that are cruel and mean and masters, more like masters than bosses, and you find yourself being more like a servant than an equal, even in those situations, Peter says, we can endure. And we must endure, and we must be subject for the Lord's sake to those in authority over us. It doesn't matter who is in authority. It matters where is your heart in relationship to that authority. Because as we said before, how you respond to those in authority over you, whether they be good or kind, he says, or whether they be scoliosis, crooked and bent and evil, God is going to judge those people. But he's looking at your heart. And he's looking at, can you and are you submitting for my sake? And that's where Peter is leading us. And that's a successful way. So when you think about it, when you want to say life's not fair, that's not fair, you come back and you say, however, or but, Jesus is still in charge. And I know that someday, somehow, in some manner, God is going to make it all right. I want to be faithful. I want to answer his call. I want to follow Christ. The lines in his steps, follow in his steps. There was a book written about 150 years ago entitled In His Steps. It was a fictional work. It was about a story about a church meeting, and they kind of had a superficial understanding of who Christ was and didn't really follow him regardless of the cost, is what Peter is saying here. And the story goes that a stranger came down to the front, challenged people to live as if Christ were truly your master. And then, according to this novel, he expired. He died in the front there. The congregation was gripped by the testimony, and this congregation took it to heart. What if I lived in his steps? What if I followed him? the hupogrammano, to write out, to trace out what he would do. How would that look? And the story goes on to talk about the editor of a newspaper who believed it actually was the original "What Would Jesus Do?" Remember that phase we had a number of years ago? That actually came back from a book, from this book, the kind of what cycles around, cycles around. And so they asked the question, what would Jesus do? The editor of the newspaper, would Jesus have advertisements for alcohol and cigarettes in his newspaper? No, so he got rid of all of those. And there are other people who had other things, and some of them succeeded, others suffered. But the point was, they were not living superficial lives. They were living lives fully committed to Jesus Christ, fully committed to following in his steps. And that's what Peter is telling us here. In relationship to how we are to be submissive to those in authority over us, we have this glorious, wonderful, amazing example of Jesus Christ. Are you following in his steps? Do you love him to know enough that I can serve under the most adverse circumstances? I can remain faithful because he remained faithful to me. What a great victory, isn't it? We're going to sing Victory in Jesus in just a moment. What a great victory that is. And next week, we're going to talk about why he did this. He's more than just our example, but he's not less. So the next time you hear yourself saying, that's not fair, give it some thought and give it to Christ. Let's pray.